Welcome to You Defend It with Rob Kilmer. The phone number to call into the show is 772-1290. As always, callers to the show will need to take a position, be able to defend it with an argument that is factual, not emotional. And if you can't make your point without insulting someone, you can't make your point on this show. Callers and guests will be treated with complete respect. For my part, I will ask questions that matter and give people the opportunity to answer. My website is www.youdefendit.com. That's youdefendit.com. You can give me your comments on the show anytime. By Friday of each week, I will have the topics up for the next week's show. This week, I want to talk about the problem with partisan ideology on the whole. The whole notion that you can take the jobs that these people are seeking when they campaign and employ ideology as you go forward, I think has been exposed as ludicrous, particularly in the last 8 years. In my view, simply stated, since ideology is theoretical by nature, it has everything to do with campaigning and nothing to do with governing. The events of this world we have seen don't confine themselves to one side's partisan handbook. They just unfold. That's just how life works, and it won't lend itself really to partisan approaches. Facts are what they are. Things happen as they happen. And I don't think anybody I know would disagree with this statement. Things have changed. That simple statement, I think, is true. And I mean for it to be as broad as it is. During your lifetime, things have changed. Everything's changed. The economy's changed. Our relations with other countries have changed. The American public and its views has changed. Everything about our lives is different now than those things were when we were younger. Therefore, a partisan ideology that has not changed and that people continue to run on both sides is useless. It's not real. And the fact that as a collective electorate we buy into this nonsense it's kind of amazing, over and over. We know what campaigns are going to be about in advance. We talk about people who are conservative versus people who are liberal. It doesn't matter. It's all nonsense. But there's a market for it. We're the market for it. We need to change the way we conduct ourselves in campaigns. And by that I mean through answers to polling questions, through how we vote. You know, in every election there's a vote, or there's a candidate who's not really willing to be a down-the-line partisan. And I think those people should get a bit more airtime, maybe some more consideration. I'll tell you what, on this show, when I talk about Ron Paul, I get an inordinately large number of calls. There's something about Ron Paul. He was a non-traditional Republican, as we know Republicans over the last 20 years. Now, Ron Paul would say that he's a traditional Republican. But my point is this. He did not run on the same principles that everybody else on the stage with him ran during the Republican primary. And that's because he recognized that things had changed, that the party needed to as well. In fact, to a large extent, he was advocating that the party needed to be what it used to be, which was less rigid ideologically. You know, Ron Paul was up there saying, because I'm a Republican, I believe we should be out of this war. Well, he didn't get very far in the Republican primaries because Republican voters couldn't reconcile that with being Republican. And this gets back to the fact that we have been inundated with so much ideology which is so divorced from the reality of the world that we live in, but that we believe is the brand. We believe we're supposed to be buying into this. We almost are at a point where we take the analysis from the ideology forward rather than the facts forward. And we try and cram the facts into the partisan pitch from either side. It just doesn't work that way. If you look at the Middle East, which we're going to when we come back, you will see a perfect example of this. All sides could claim to be entitled. When I say all sides, I mean of the conflict over there. Could be entitled to support from Republicans or Democrats based on their view of the facts. And I think, as I was thinking about this yesterday, what's going on in the Middle East right now absolutely confounds partisanship. There's no partisan way to look at it, because the things that the parties claim to stand for are present really in the situation for both combatants. I'll explain that more when we come back. You're listening to You Defend It with Rob Kilmer right here on News Radio 1290 WNBF Binghamton. Okay, getting back to what I was talking about. Actually, Bob, are you there?
Yeah, Rob.
Welcome to the show.
I really enjoy your show. I try to listen every week, and you're so on the mark on so many things.
But not this one?
Oh yeah. You're on pretty much. Like Mr. Obama. Okay, to me, I mean, you could say, a lot of people say he's like the Messiah. He's promised everybody everything, some wonderful things, and if he could really deliver them, it would be great. But some of the things he wants to do goes against economic theory that I learned in college, and I understand he wants the military to open their arms to gays and not have to be don't tell, don't ask. And then the things with all the, like, WPA type programs for highways, bridges, infrastructure, education, that's good to an extent, like priming the pump, but then there's other, excuse my voice, other economic problems with the net product being consumed, as a government project paid for by taxes, either taxes or more debt. And the debt, there's just more debt and more debt and more debt. And when it goes overseas, like you said before, the people that are consuming or buying the debt are our enemies in some cases. And, people that have sworn that they'll bury us or kill us all, and that's the scary thing about it.
I think you are absolutely right. Thanks for the call.
Okay, thanks.
As far as Barack Obama is concerned, I try, and you may have noticed that I've tried to stay out of this, laying the groundwork for the greatest administration ever. I don't know what's going to happen with Barack Obama. I have no idea. I know that amazingly enough, the problems are much worse now than they were even a few months ago. I mean, that campaign changed, in my mind, with the financial crisis. And people drew judgments with respect to who was handling that news better and who was more stoic. I don't know. But most Americans don't comprehend what the crisis is exactly. It hasn't affected people in their everyday lives as much as the numbers would indicate. And I mean, when I say people, I mean people in this area. However, today, Circuit City begins liquidating. They're done. I think we are going to see it locally. And I think that the encouraging thing about Barack Obama, for me, is that he's not committing to a partisan approach to anything. I mean, the people he brought in right off the bat were moderates. He seems at least to be committed to solving problems in the best way possible. I hope he does it. He says he's gonna, the only people I hear calling him the Messiah are conservatives claiming that the media called him the Messiah when the media didn't call him the Messiah. It's good. It's kind of like when you're preparing for a debate and you want to build up the other side so that a great performance as compared to an expectation of an excellent performance seems like a failure. I feel like a lot of that's going on, and I don't know why we're wasting time with any of it, because if ever there was a time that this country faced enormous challenges, this is it. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the Middle East as an example of how campaigning is one thing, governing is another, and the situation in the Middle East right now has you can't encapsulate it. You can't fit it neatly into any one conservative or liberal box. It just doesn't work that way. And it's an example of how government is every day. People like George Bush, for example. A lot of conservatives claim to be disappointed in him because he wasn't conservative enough when it came to spending. Well, he was nobody's ever going to be able to reduce spending. I'm saying that not because I'm a defeatist, but because I'm a realist. I hear people talk about getting back to Republican values and reducing spending. Republicans never did it. We've had a real debt, since Reagan took office. They've never cut spending once. 20 of the last 28 years, we've had Republican presidents. Not one of those 20 years saw a decrease in spending. So this notion that we need to get back to something is myth, when what you're getting back to never existed in the first place. And I don't mean to criticize Republicans. What I'm saying is that it's another example of the difference between the rhetoric out there and the reality. Whenever I watched Tim Russert, because he was the best at this, he'd have people campaigning saying, we need to cut spending. He'd say, where? Well, we need to look at that would be the answer you get. We need to look at everything across the board. And he'd say, what are you going to cut? Specifically, what are you cutting? Nobody ever had an answer for that. Not surprisingly, spending was never cut. Things cost more every year than they did the year before. And the notion that you're going to cut spending, it's just a fallacy. It's not real. People run on it as if they're going to do it, and the public just willingly suspends its ability to confirm facts when it comes to the next election. If they were willing to look and see, well, did this person cut spending, they'd find out the answer was no. In the Middle East right now, what is the conservative solution to the Middle East? There isn't one. What is the liberal solution to the Middle East? There isn't one. Blind support of Israel is a necessary part of winning elections in America, it seems. But blind support of Israel won't solve a single problem in the Middle East. And I'm not saying Israel's right or wrong. It's complicated. That's the big problem. We, as Americans, have become used to simple solutions to complicated problems that never work. Because the problems, they are what they are. They exist in and of themselves. They don't change. They don't become less complicated because the solution that's been proposed is a simple one. Complicated problems need complicated solutions. And that has somehow, in the last 10 years or so, become almost a weakness to recognize the complexity of issues and not be able to summarize your solution to a problem that's been existing for 10 decades in 8 words or less. But that's how we think, and that's why it doesn't work. In the Middle East right now, we are now seeing, for the 18 millionth time, the same scenario play itself out. Israel's enemies attack Israeli civilians and launch these attacks from civilian neighborhoods. Israel has enough, cracks down, and the lopsided numbers draw international condemnation. As of yesterday, I think it was, Israel had lost 13 soldiers, had killed 1,000 plus Palestinians, and over half of them were, unfortunately, civilians. Bottom line, no progress. Nothing. When you're killing kids, you're making people mad. Now, I'm not saying that as anything other than a pure fact, and it is undeniable. If you are a 17-year-old unemployed Palestinian and your little brother gets blown to bits by an Israeli bomb, what is it that we think that person is going to do? I mean, isn't there almost an assumption in there? Imagine how ridiculous this is. That person is going to say, you know what? We deserve this. We really need to stop rocketing Israel. The reality is, from that moment on, that 17-year-old is the latest recruit in Hamas and will dedicate the rest of his life to killing as many Israelis as he can. And that's what happens. You kill civilians, it's a really effective recruiting tool. Paul Harvey is up next from 8:30 to 8:35, and we will be back right after him. You are listening to You Defend It with Rob Kilmer right here on News Radio 1290 WNBF Binghamton. Welcome back to You Defend It with Rob Kilmer on News Radio 1290. Phone number to call in is 772-1290. I have Marion on the line from Binghamton. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Welcome.
Well, I'd like to clarify. It's important to have facts, and this is not getting around.
Okay.
I read an article, and this is written by Joseph Farah, Farah, and I think he's an Arab, and someone's going to kill him for writing this. He says the Palestinian people do not exist. If you know it historically, you might look at it and see. And the other point I want to make is that the extremists use their children as shields. So no matter what Israel is trying to do to avoid hitting people like that, how do you avoid it when they think they're all going to heaven, and they use them as shields? And those are the 2 points I wanted to make. Well,
thanks very much for calling in.
Thank you.
Right. She's right that Marion's right that the Hamas right now, that the rockets are fired from civilian neighborhoods, essentially daring Israel to respond there, and Israel does. I read somewhere this week that there are meetings taking place by Hamas in hospitals, and that will be the next decision for Israel to make. And if the past is any indication, there are going to be fewer hospitals next week in Gaza than there are this week. Israel bombed the UN building in Gaza because they were under the belief that there was something coming from there, or that people were hiding there. I mean, there's no question that Israel goes out and they'll kill you where they find you. And they have put up with enough to this point. But we're just talking about the fighting. We're not talking about the solution. And the discussions of these wars, we had one 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they all go about the same way. Well, Hamas deserves it. Or in the case 2 years ago or 3 years ago, Hezbollah deserves it. They attack Israeli civilians, and what do they expect? And that is the conversation. Now, if you were to listen to the Palestinian position on this, there's so much political correctness with this, I almost have to disclaim it before I say it. Not that I'm endorsing what they do. The territories, Gaza in particular, Israel has occupied it for 41 years. There's no economy in there. There's nothing. There's military checkpoints and zero hope of getting anywhere if you are born there. Your best way to succeed if you were born there is to leave there. Now, they have few rights in Gaza. And Israel has been an occupying force there since 1967. Now, getting back to my point for this show, which is that real-world events have nothing to do with the partisan rhetoric, the nonsense that is espoused during campaigns. Well, if freedom's on the march in the Middle East, aren't we going to bring it to Gaza? I mean, they have an elected government. They're being oppressed by Israel. If you believe them, are we going to bring... Is that freedom that's on the march going to be marching into Gaza with us supporting it all the way? Of course not. How about Saudi Arabia? We marching there? No. The partisan language that has become issue discussion in this country is useless. It's not applicable to the very issues that it speaks to. You can find a conservative or liberal perspective on all of these issues. It's in America's best interests to resolve the problems in the Middle East. Instability over there causes problems for us. That should be our singular objective and the rationale behind it. Resolving the problems in the Middle East is the most important thing that America can do to protect itself, to ensure its national security. And whatever it takes to resolve it is what you do. That's my feeling. Now, it's going to be complicated. It's not simple. A lot of people in this country make a lot of money telling you that it's simple. Your eyes and ears tell you that it's not. You've seen it. You've heard the news. It is not a simple problem. Simple problems don't last for decades. Simple problems last for minutes. Complicated problems, on the other hand, last a bit longer. We need to approach the Middle East as a national security issue for the United States, because that's what it is. The people who supply us with oil, unfortunately, at this point, still, are aligned against Israel and are to some extent aligned against us when these flare-ups happen. We talked last week about the fact that the oil shortages in the mid-70s or early 70s, that was related to conflict in the Middle East and our support of Israel. That wasn't good for America. And you'll notice I'm not saying that what we should do should be governed by what's right and wrong. That has nothing to do with anything when it comes to foreign policy. No other country on earth is acting that way. We aren't acting that way. We never have. We have supported and continue to support dictatorial, oppressive regimes on this planet. I think we made an enormous mistake when we didn't find the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq by saying, no, what we really meant to say is the reason we're here is to bring freedom around the world. Once we started down that road, it became impossible to get anything done. The rest of the world does not want the United States of America telling them how to govern. In fact, look at Iraq right now. Iraq is supporting the Palestinians. We've spent how many, hundreds of billions, maybe $1 trillion on Iraq? And they're supporting, they're condemning Israel, and they're not condemning the rockets that are showered down on Israeli civilians by Hamas? Of course they're not. There's hundreds of years of hatred there. And more intensely so since 1947. Because it's complex. It's not simple. We need to get everybody together over there and find a workable solution that makes everybody a little unhappy. Those seem to be the best. And it's in our interest to do it. And if it means telling the Israelis certain things they don't want to hear, then so be it. But this can't go on forever. It's disruptive to our national interests for this to continue to go forward. There is no question that Israel is constantly and repeatedly victimized by its neighbors. No question. But let's end it. And you'll hear some people saying the only way it can end is with a long, a bloody war, a once and for all. That is idiotic talk. What are you going to do? How many people live in the surrounding countries? How many millions of people are we talking about killing? How are you going to kill them? And this once and for all thing, what does that even mean? Taking over their land? Because if you don't, they're going to attack you from it. They're going to regroup and retaliate. We've seen that on a smaller scale with the Taliban. It didn't take them long. In fact, I think on the news I heard this morning as I was getting ready to do the show that there were suicide bombers in Afghanistan yesterday. We need to recommit ourselves to abandoning ideology and embracing practicality to resolve these issues that threaten us. There is no reason not to do it. We'll be back. Okay, we left off talking about the fact that the problems in the Middle East are more complicated than the solutions that have been proposed would lead you to believe. And we don't like complicated. We have been told that simple solutions are the best solutions, but they're not. They're the easiest, and they don't work. And what I am hoping, at least, with the Obama administration is that there will be more of an emphasis on telling people that situations are harder than they realize. That's what's needed here. We need somebody who's going to be honest and say, I'm going to try and solve this problem. I'm going to address this challenge, but understand this. It's not as simple as you think, and here's why. When the financial crisis struck a few months ago, I had made the point that the only person who really came out and made any attempt to explain it was George Bush. And I thought he did a good job. That's what we need more of. We need explanation, not recrimination. Now would be an awful time, with as many challenges as we are facing, to not get together and try and resolve them. But to do that, there has to be an acknowledgement of the problem and the complexities associated with it. For every issue, for the economy. I mean, when you think about the economy, think of a big pyramid with a bunch of layers to it, and the very top layer is where we have this conversation about taxing and spending. How much the government should spend, how much the government should tax. You know, your typical conservative liberal argument. But if everything under that in the pyramid isn't working, then the top part doesn't matter. When we talk about government spending, when we have these traditional conservative liberal arguments about what the government should be doing with money, there are massive assumptions in there concerning banks and what they're doing, the underlying conduct of the banks, and that they're lending to one another, and that there aren't these toxic problems with the underlying financial structure. When you're talking about a budget for the United States, when you're talking about the economy and how much the government should be spending and how much the government should be taxing, you are talking about the smallest part of the economy as a whole. There's a whole host of things, bigger things, that need to be working before any of that can even happen. That's what we need to know more about. I suspect most Americans don't understand the crisis right now. You have to really look into it. You have to pretty much find out on your own what it's all about. That banks lend to each other overnight. And if that doesn't happen, you have an instant crisis. I don't think most people were aware of that. And that's because the people who are in charge of this country, the people who are running it, the Congress, the President, they don't explain it. You know, I made reference here on this show, I don't know, a month or so ago about a comment I heard Peggy Noonan make, which was that it's been left to the press to educate the public. That's not our job. And the press gets criticized for having slants or biases, which everybody does. Everybody. But they're only supposed to be reporting on what happened. Instead, they spend a disproportionate amount of time trying to explain the underlying issues because the people who are in charge, the people who are actually responsible for these issues, don't themselves explain it. Because it's complicated. I don't think that strategy can sustain itself anymore. But I think the American will to get itself out of a jam still exists. The American will to succeed and overcome is there. It just hasn't been reached. Planes bombing Pearl Harbor, that's a simple concept to understand. We could get behind that one. The problem now is that the facts are a little murkier with the challenges we face today. And other than September 11th, we don't feel it here quite the way we did in 1941. But we're starting to feel it here from an economic standpoint. There's going to be thousands of people at Circuit City in the next couple weeks. Then there's going to be nobody at Circuit City after that. What does that mean? That means Staples is in a much better position. That means there's fewer places to compete, or that there will be fewer places competing for those types of products. Not a great thing, but we'll see it. Plus, there are 80 people losing their jobs at Circuit City. And if somebody, and I'm hoping it's Obama, is willing to use the airwaves to say, these are the problems, this is what I'm doing to resolve them. But they're not simple problems. And here's why. Explain the complexities as best you can. And if the public feels like it's got something in the game, which it will, the more and more people are being affected. There are more foreclosures now than there were, 80% more now. People are losing their jobs. People know people who have lost their jobs. The more this encroaches on our actual lives, the more willing we will be to participate in the solution. All we need is somebody to explain it, and to explain the reality of it, and to commit to fixing it in a way that is governed by the facts and the facts alone. Not by ideology, not by blame, but by simply saying, this is what's wrong, this is what we're going to do to fix it. Because it makes sense. Newt Gingrich is fond of saying, Republicans and Democrats agree on more issues than they disagree on. And he advocates that in any legislative session, those issues upon which the parties agree should be done first. They should be resolved first. That legislation should be passed and done with. Instead, the parties put those in their pocket to use as leverage. You won't get what we agree on unless you agree with me on this issue with which we have a dispute. Nobody wins there. I think the country, even now, is in a position to embrace some nonpartisanship because the situation is just too darn serious anymore. There's no room for that kind of noise where you have a limited amount of time to solve some big problems. This country is on the verge of losing its place in the world. And I don't mean its moral standing or any of that other stuff. I mean from an economic standpoint. There was an article last week that China, I believe, is not going to be buying American debt anymore. Perhaps to some extent, the only thing more worrisome than one of our enemies buying up our debt is when they decide that even that isn't in their interest anymore. That's a reflection on the American economy. So, I'm hoping we'll listen to his inaugural speech. We'll see what he says, and we'll see how he governs. But it's not just him, it's everybody. Everybody has to buy in to solving problems in a way that actually resolves them rather than just lays the groundwork for blaming somebody else when the problem persists. Thank you for listening to You Defend It, and we will be back next week. he did not run on the same principles that everybody else on the stage with him ran during the Republican primary. And that's because he recognized that things had changed, that the party needed to as well. In fact, to a large extent, he was advocating that the party needed to be what it used to be, which was less rigid ideologically. You know, Ron Paul was up there saying, because I'm a Republican, I believe we should be out of this war. Well, he didn't get very far in the Republican primaries because Republican voters couldn't reconcile that with being Republican. And this gets back to the fact that we have been inundated with so much ideology which is so divorced from the reality of the world that we live in, but that we believe is the brand. We believe we're supposed to be buying into this. We almost are at a point where we take the analysis from the ideology forward rather than the facts forward. And we try and cram the facts into the partisan pitch from either side. It just doesn't work that way. If you look at the Middle East, which we're going to when we come back, you will see a perfect example of this. All sides could claim to be entitled. When I say all sides, I mean of the conflict over there. Could be entitled to support from Republicans or Democrats based on their view of the facts. And I think, as I was thinking about this yesterday, what's going on in the Middle East right now absolutely confounds partisanship. There's no partisan way to look at it, because the things that the parties claim to stand for are present really in the situation for both combatants. I'll explain that more when we come back. You're listening to You Defend It with Rob Kilmer right here on News Radio 1290 WNBF Binghamton.